Okay. Here we go. All right. Here we are. Part 3 of the semantics lecture. So believe it or not, this is the last part of the last lecture. So congratulations, you made it this far. You're almost at the end of Linguistics 101. Hang in there. You can do it. And we can go enjoy ourselves when this is all over. Until fall semester starts, right? Okay. So let's talk about voice alterations. And what we're going to do is start by revisiting these examples from the previous video. I ate the cake and the cake was eaten by me. As we established in the previous video, if we move from this sentence to this sentence and try to describe what happened, we see that the agent and the patient kind of switch places. The patient is now the subject, the agent. Right, excuse me, the patient is now the subject, and the agent not only switches spots, but has also been demoted. It didn't become a direct object, it became something less than a direct object. It became an oblique, right? Something we could even remove. So why would English speakers do this when speaking English? Because you might think, basically both of these sentences mean the same thing, that a first-person entity ate some cake. So what is the point of saying this in this way? What is the point of saying it in a slightly more complicated way? To put this more simply, what is the difference in meaning between these two sentences, right? We seem to have the same signified, but two slightly different signifiers, right? Two slightly different structures. Are these different signs? Do these mean different things? The answer is yes. So this one down here does mean something different, a little bit different. I still ate the cake. But when I say this, when I say the cake was eaten by me, I am drawing your attention to the cake and not to me. I am emphasizing the patient, the cake, and I am de-emphasizing who ate the cake, the agent or me. In other words, the fact that it was me who ate the cake in this sentence in this latter sentence is not really important anymore. The thing the speaker is making important here is that the cake and the fact that it was eaten. So it's a slightly different meaning. Yes, I ate the cake, but the focus has changed a little bit. When I say this, I want you to think more about the cake and less about me. This is called a passive sentence. You've probably heard of passive sentences before. Passive constructions like this are a type of what we call grammatical voice, or just voice. So voice is the way that a relationship between a predicate and its arguments is framed. When we change voice, we are changing how the relationship is framed. The relationship doesn't change very much, or at all. The thematic roles of the arguments are still the same, but the way we're thinking about those arguments does, thus resulting in a change of meaning, which is exactly what we're interested in when we're doing semantics. So again, to reiterate, voice alterations are a means of changing the voice or the framing of a particular sentence. And it does this by changing the grammatical roles of the arguments. In this example on top, this is what we call active voice in English, which is sort of like the default. The agent is the subject in this one. And in this one, we have changed the sentence to be a passive voice, in which the agent has been demoted from a subject to an oblique, and the patient has been promoted from a direct object to the subject. Now, this can be a tricky thing to wrap your head around, especially when looking at it the first time. So let's drill down now on some examples using real data. But before we do that, I am putting a content warning here. There will be some brief textual descriptions of police violence and some violence in general. But these are violent things that have actually happened in the real world. And by textual, I mean there aren't any images or audio or video of violence. It's just text, just some headlines. But it's still real violence that really happened. It's nothing too explicit. There's no gore or anything. And as far as I am aware, the acts of violence that will be mentioned did not result in anyone dying. But I just thought that I should, just in case, to put a content warning out there. So if this isn't your thing and you don't want to see this, please skip to the next chapter thing, right? So in YouTube, in your scrub bar down there, you can see the video is divided into sections. So just skip to the next section if you don't want to see these sentences which contain headlines that describe police violence. So the reason I'm using these examples is because even though they might be somewhat upsetting, they are a really on-point illustration of voice alterations in English, and furthermore, the real-life effects and consequences that happen when we use voice alterations. So here we go, content warning part. Okay, so let's start with spelling out the active voice and the passive voice in English. English only has two voices, active and passive. There are other voices. The reading in the syntax module mentions at least one other, but we're going to focus on these two, which are the only two voices that English has. So again, we have the active voice, which is the default. It highlights the agent's participation in the predicate by making the agent the subject. Passive voice, by contrast, wants you to almost forget about the agent. It's not important. The important thing here is that the patient and the predicate self. Passive is basically saying, don't look at the agent, look over here at the patient. So let's use some of those real-world examples I mentioned. So this is a tweet from the New York Times from sometime in 2020 during the George Floyd protests. So I'm sure most of you have heard of this, but basically, in the United States, in a place called Minnesota, the police there killed a guy named George Floyd. And I think most everybody agrees that his death was unnecessary. The controversy that you have heard or will hear about this is mostly about whether the police officers who killed him should be held responsible or not. And that's as far as I'm going to get into that subject. I'm just make sure we have I'm sure we have all of our opinions about that. We're just establishing some context here. So anyway, there were a lot of protests and civil unrest all across the country. I think we even had some protests up here in Canada. So anyway, here's the New York Times, which is a media / newspaper sort of organization, a pretty famous one in the United States. And they're reporting on all of this with a tweet. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at these sentences and determine if they are active or passive. And importantly, the more important question we're going to ask is, why might some of these be active and why might the others be passive? So let's start with the first one up here. A photographer was shot in the eye. Let's start with our grammatical roles. So we have a subject, a photographer. We have the predicate, was shot, and the oblique argument, in the eye. Now let's assign the thematic roles. So someone is getting shot. It's clearly a patient, right? They're being permanently changed in some way by the effect of the predicate here. And by the way, I looked it up. This photographer luckily did not die. I think they had to lose their eye, but luckily they did not die from this incident here. And it says we have the patient, and our other argument, shot in the eye, which is a location. We know this because this argument starts with a preposition, in the eye. So notice something interesting here. There's no agent. There's an implied agent, right? Some agent somewhere had to pull the trigger, but we're not told who that someone is. The agent has clearly been erased from the sentence. So this is clearly a passive sentence. The agent is non-existent. It doesn't want us to think about the agent. It just wants to put all of our attention on the patient. It is framed in a way in which we are paying attention to the patient and the predicate, but not the agent. All right, let's look at the next one. Protesters struck a journalist with his own microphone. So we have a predicate, struck, and three arguments. Protesters, a journalist, and with his own microphone. So this is a transitive predicate, right? To strike is a hit something. We need a striker and something to be striked. So let's assign our grammatical roles. The protesters are the subject, the journalist is the direct object, and the thing with the microphone is the oblique. Okay, now let's do the thematic roles. Again, transitive predicate. We need an agent and a patient. The protesters are the agent. The journalist is the patient, and the microphone, thing with the microphone, is the instrument. It's the thing that the agent used to affect the patient. So here, the agent and its participation in the predicate is front and center. The agent is the subject. This is an active sentence. All right, our attention is being drawn to the fact that it was the protesters who did this thing. And now let's look at the last one. So this is a long sentence, a bit of a doozy. So I'm going to put some brackets around these arguments. Oh yeah, this is an active sentence. I'm going to put some brackets around the arguments that we're dealing with just to make this a little more easier to visualize. So also, another side note, syntactically speaking, there are more syntactic levels of this sentence. If you look at the last argument, by an officer who appeared to be aiming at her, you could break that down into smaller sentences, right? There are two more predicates in there, appear and aiming. But we're not going to worry about that for the moment. All right, so our predicate is was hit. This is transitive. Minimally, we need a hitter and someone being hit. So let's do our grammatical roles first. Bam. So there we have a subject and three obliques. That's kind of interesting, right? We know they're obliques because each of them start with a preposition. By a pepper ball, on live television, by an officer. Notice that we don't have any direct objects. That's a clue to what kind of the voice here is, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's do our thematic roles. So this is going to be a bit messy, but here's our subject, the reporter, who is also our patient. We have the pepper ball, the instrument, the thing that was, like the weapon, basically, the instrument, the thing that the agent used to carry out the predicate. We have on live television, which is a location. Just to say, this isn't like a literal location where this predicate took place, because the reporter was not actually shot standing or sitting on a television, but the event was recorded and shown on live television. But anyway, we're not going to worry about that distinction. That's just a location. And finally, we have by an officer who appeared to be aiming at her. There's our agent. So the agent, notice that the agent is way in the back, behind all the other arguments and demoted to an oblique argument. And again, as a side note, there's all these qualifiers in here. An officer who appeared to be aiming at her. So the patient has been promoted to the subject position and the agent has been demoted. This is clearly a passive sentence. So we broke these sentences down to their basic constituents, predicates, arguments, grammatical and thematical roles. Now let's come back to the second question that I brought up a couple minutes ago. So we have one active sentence and two passive sentences. Why aren't they all active? Or why isn't the second one passive? Active voice is supposed to be the default. Why would you put sentences 1 and 3 in the passive? What is it about the meaning of these sentences that led whoever it was that wrote these to put 2 of them in the passive voice and 1 of them in the active voice? So to answer that question, let's remember what the point of the passive is. The point of the passive is to de-emphasize the participation of the patient. De-emphasize the participation of the agent. So the agent is the key factor here. So there must be something special about the agents in these sentences that made the writer feel like they needed to change the voice for some of them, right? The writer felt like they needed to get rid of the agent in the first sentence and de-emphasize it and demote the agent in the third one. Well, you probably saw this coming from a mile away, but the answer here is that The agents in sentences 1 and 3 are the police, while the agent in sentence 2 is not the police. So basically what we see here is that when the police do something, the people who write these things don't focus on the police, or they don't want you to focus on the police. They focus on the patient and what happened to them. If the agent is not the police, the agent and his action is in front and center position, just as is the case in sentence 2. In the active voice, they want you to focus on the responsible party, the party who is responsible for the action situation. But if the police are the responsible party for a particular action, they don't want you to think about that. This is a pretty pervasive thing in American media, American news media. The way in which using the passive to describe police violence has a significant effect on public discourse and is an important topic. It's an important topic and an interesting topic, but unfortunately, talking about that topic is one that is outside the scope of this class, in which we are simply describing the mechanisms by which this happened. So in my role here as the instructor of this particular linguistics course, I am not here to say that doing this, using the passive voice to downplay police violence, is a good or bad thing. What I am pointing out is that this is a thing that actually happens, something that happens a lot, or at least in the United States. Whether this is a good or bad thing is something that we all have opinions on, that I definitely have an opinion on, but that's something to be discussed outside of this class, right? So if I was to share an opinion one way or the other, that could get us into trouble here. Anyway, the point is, what I'm saying is that this is a tool. I'm also not saying that using the passive voice in general is a good or bad thing. I am saying that it is a tool that the passive voice is a tool that some languages use, and that this tool has a very specific function, which is to downplay or de-emphasize or even hide the participation of the agent in an action. So that's all I wanted to do here. These are not pleasant examples, but I think it is important to use real language data and discuss, at least very briefly, the effects that linguistic semantics like this, voice constructions, the effect that they have on the real world, Okay. Now, end of content warning time. So we're back to looking at things that are not as triggering, hopefully. So let's look at another example. Here we have active and passive voice. Susan kicked the ball, active. The agent's participation in the predicate is highlighted by being the subject. And we have our other sentence, the ball was kicked by Susan, passive voice. The agent is de-emphasized and demoted to be an oblique object. So these examples are pretty simple, but sometimes it can be tricky, like we saw in those previous examples that are a bit larger. It can be tricky to keep track of what is happening to the arguments. One way to keep track of it is to use what is called a diathesis table. This is from the reading in the syntax module. So you can organize your arguments by thematic roles, since thematic roles don't change. And then you can keep track of the grammatical roles as they change. So in the first sentence, the agent is the subject. And in the second sentence, the agent is now an oblique object. I've added these little colors here to make this even more obvious. The patient in the first sentence, the ball, becomes a subject in the second sentence. So using a diathesis table like this can be a useful thing for helping you to figure out what kind of voice alteration is going on. So in the examples we've looked at so far, they've all been in English. And remember that the way that English encodes grammatical relations is mostly by word order. So if we're going to do a voice alteration in English, which is something that, a voice alteration changes the grammatical roles of the arguments to result in a slightly different meaning. That means in English, if you want to switch from active to passive, you have to move the arguments around. But other languages may do things differently depending on how that language encodes its grammatical relations. Let's look at Mandarin Chinese. So we have a sentence. A dog bit this man. This is an active voice, right? The agent, the dog, is a subject and is front and center. But in the passive form, the dog gets moved over here. And in fact, it is optional now. It does not need to be expressed. The patient, the man, gets moved up to the front. Let's see, here's some colors to help keep track of the agent and the patient. So at first glance, it looks like the alternation between active and passive voice in Mandarin Chinese work a lot like they do in English. Changing the grammatical roles of the arguments results in moving the arguments around. Mandarin Chinese, after all, does use word order to encode grammatical relations, just like English does. However, there's another difference. In the passive sentence, we have this extra word thrown in there. Would that be like bay? I'm not sure I can get the tone right, but it's something like bay. And it's glossed as passive. So as far as a non-Chinese speaker like myself can tell, to do a passive in Chinese, not only do you need to change the word order, but you also have to add this passive particle, or word, or whatever it is. And again, this is similar to English, in which we have to insert something like a preposition, or no, like a has been. So the man has bitten the dog. This man has been bitten, right? We have this auxiliary verb being shoved in there as the predicate. So English, Chinese, they're very similar in how they do voice alternations, at least between active and passive. I believe Chinese does have another kind of voice construction. It's called a middle voice. We're not going to go into it, but just FYI. Let's look at another language. This is Russian. We have an active and a passive sentence. Remember that Russian uses case and agreement to encode grammatical relations. Thus, if we're going to look at an alternation between active voice and passive voice, we can expect that things are going to change in the case and agreement systems here. So at first glance, we can see that the arguments haven't really moved. We have the boy closed the book, and the book was closed by the boy. The boy and the book are both more or less in the same positions in both sentences. The boy comes first and the book is last. Boy is before the predicate, the book is after the predicate. So word order is not at play in this particular voice alteration. So what is changing then? What is the element being manipulated to get us these different voice constructions, these different meanings? Let's look at the arguments first. Let's compare the arguments in the active sentence to those in the passive sentence. We can see some differences. The arguments are marked for different cases now. The boy, who in the active sentence was marked for a nominative case, is now marked in the instrumental case in the passive. And note that its grammatical role is now instrument rather than subject. And now what about the patient, the book? So in the active sentence, the book is marked with the accusative, but in the passive sentence is marked as nominative. So remember that in case marking languages, nominative means subject. Thus, the grammatical role of the book is now the subject. So case marking on the arguments has told us that the agent, who was a subject in the active sentence, has now been demoted to an oblique. And simultaneously, the patient, which was a direct object in the active sentence, has been promoted up to subject. So that alone, just looking at case, is a pretty good indicator that we have a passive sentence here, an active and passive alteration. It lines up, this one lines up with our definition. Whoop, sorry. Stupid button. All right. There we go. Yeah, so yeah, it lines up with our definition of a passive sentence, in which a subject is demoted and an object is promoted, and that object becomes the focus of the sentence as the subject. Or rather, the patient is promoted to subject and becomes the focus of the sentence. Now, there's another clue here, and that's the agreement between the verb and the arguments. In the active sentence, the verb agrees with the subject. It's agreeing with the agent. That subject is the agent. But in the passive sentence, the verb still agrees with the subject, but the subject isn't the agent anymore. The subject is the patient. And the marking on the verb changes to reflect that. So in the active sentence, the verb is marked for masculine singular. The verb is agreeing with the subject, who is the agent, who is the boy, who is also marked for masculine singular. However, in the passive sentence, though, the verb changes now, and it's marked with feminine singular, which matches the feminine singular marking on the book, which is now the subject, but is still the patient. So agreement also tells us that this is a passive sentence by virtue of the fact that the verb agrees with the semantic patient argument rather than the agent. So even if Russian didn't have any case marking, let's just say Russian, let's just get rid of all of our case glosses here and all of the case morphemes. Even if Russian didn't have any case marking, we could still know that we're seeing a change from an active to a passive sentence by virtue of what the verb agrees with. Yeah, that's really, so the fact that the verb agrees with the patient now tells us this is a passive, and we can know that even if we don't have all the nominative and accusative and instrumental cases going on here. So that's all I want to say about voice alterations. Again, we've only looked at active and passive voice, the two voice constructions that English has. Other languages have larger inventories of voice constructions. There are middle constructions, anti-passives, and they do things like promote an instrument to the subject, or maybe they demote they keep the subject stays the agent, but the object is removed. I think that's an anti-passive. We're not going to look into those, unfortunately. If you take more linguistics classes in the future, you may run into some. But for the purpose of this class, we're just going to focus on the active and passive constructions and what they mean, right? And why what they mean is important. Okay, so that's it. You have made it to the end of the last lecture. For your quiz this Friday, you should know these things here. What signs are and what they have to do with meaning, and those word meanings. Like, what is the term for words that sound the same but have different meanings? What is the term for a word that has one word that has multiple related meanings? That sort of thing. You will also need to be able to identify thematic roles, agent, patient, instrument, experiencer, etc. And you need to know about voice alterations, specifically active and passive voices, how they're constructed, and what the difference in meaning is when you alter the voice. So do the reading. Feel free to contact me with any questions. We will be having a review session this Thursday, in which, and again, I'm going to record it, assuming that people show up and have questions to ask and want things to go through. If no one shows up, there will be nothing to record. So that's just an FYI, So on Friday, you have your quiz. I will be making an announcement with some information about the final exam sometime this week, and how that's going to work. But for the moment, just study for your quiz. Make sure your participation, your research participation is done, and do the extra credit assignment if you need it. So that's it. Have a good week, everyone. Now let's end this. There we go. Stop recording.